What happens to troops if the US defaults on its debt? All of that and more today, May 17th, 2023. Good morning, Early Birds. I'm Jonathan Lehrfeld, and this is the Early Bird Brief, produced by Defense News and Military Times. First up, if the U.S. defaults on its debt, it could threaten troop pay, defense programs, and more. That's part of the conversation as President Joe Biden and senior congressional officials try to broker a deal to raise the nation's debt ceiling. Unless Congress acts, the Treasury is expected to reach the current limit sometime around June 1st. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy said earlier this week he's not optimistic about reaching a debt ceiling agreement soon.
There is no movement, and when you look what we're going, if this is where we were in February we're talking, we'd be in a good place, but we're only a couple weeks away. And if you look at the timeline to pass something in the House and pass something in the Senate, you've got to have something done by this weekend, and we are nowhere near any of that.
The Republican plan would roll back spending and includes other policy changes. Biden has called on lawmakers to lift the debt limit without preconditions. Here's why it matters. Without a solution, the country could, for the first time in history, default on its debts. That would create a cascade of financial problems across the economy. While no one knows for sure what a U.S. debt default will mean for military operations and veteran support programs, there is widespread agreement that it won't be good. Military paychecks could be delayed or stopped altogether. Veterans' benefits checks could similarly be delivered erratically. Equipment purchases could be canceled. Contractors and civilian workers could face the choice of furloughs or working without any guarantee of stable pay. McCarthy said the Republican plan would lift the borrowing ceiling while curbing spending.
We can raise the debt ceiling if we limit what we're going to spend in the future. You put caps so we have adult supervision. I mean, how much is too much?
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said a default would be devastating for millions of Americans.
We all know these things are fast approaching the closer we get to June 1st. Congress cannot, under any circumstances, fail its obligation to protect the full faith and credit of the United States.
According to the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Defense Department is due to pay about $12 billion to military and civilian retirees on June 1st. Roughly $7 billion is owed to defense vendors between June 5th and June 17th. Another $4 billion in military salary checks are set to be sent out on June 15th. Similarly, about $25 billion in veterans' benefits set to be paid out in June could be delayed by days or weeks. That delay would likely cause problems for millions of families that depend on that support for their monthly income. If Treasury officials prioritize those payments, veterans and service members might not see any disruptions. But that would mean delays to other government payouts instead. That includes things like Medicare support, non-defense federal salaries, and interest payments on the national debt. If the U.S. fails to pay that, it would downgrade the country's credit rating, creating even more debt. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen discussed the impacts of the standoff in remarks at the Independent Community Bankers of America Summit.
The U.S. economy hangs in the balance. The livelihoods of millions of Americans do too. So there's no time to waste. Congress should address the debt limit as soon as possible.
The damage only gets worse if the crisis drags on well into the summer. Another $14 billion in defense vendor payouts are due before July 15th, when another $3 billion in military paychecks and bonuses are scheduled to be paid out. Another important story, 2 Indo-Pacific countries used their hotline for the first time ever. Japan and China's defense ministers talked on their call for about 20 minutes. The hotline was established March 31st. It hadn't been used yet. This all comes as Japan and other Chinese neighbors worry about China's military actions. Japan and China's defense ministers talked on their call for about 20 minutes. The hotline was established March 31st. This all comes as Japan and other Chinese neighbors worry about China's military actions. Many view them as becoming more and more aggressive. Japan and China are currently at odds over tiny islands in the East China Sea controlled by Japan. China has regularly sent its Coast Guard into the airspace and maritime waters around the islands. The forces usually harass Japanese ships, and that forces Japan to scramble jets in a military response. China's naval fleet also regularly circles around Japanese coasts. Those exercises are sometimes done jointly with the Russian military. Those military moves have annoyed Japan, and the island nation is worried about the tensions around self-ruled Taiwan. China's leaders claim the sovereign island nation as its territory and have threatened to take the island by force if necessary. Japan's defense minister said the open communication is necessary given the contentions over the islands. He said communication is even more important when sides aren't necessarily getting along. The pair of ministers also ensured the hotline was working properly and agreed to continue communication between their respective defense authorities. The two defense officials emphasized the importance of the maritime and aerial communication mechanism, which includes the hotline. They said those important factors will help build trust between the two sides and helps avoid contingencies. In 2018, the country's prime ministers agreed on the hotline as a way to avoid accidental clashes between their militaries. In other news, a fight is shaping up over the fiscal year 2024 budget for the Department of Veterans Affairs. For more on this brewing budget fight, Military Times Capitol Hill Bureau Chief Leo Shane III breaks it all down for us.
Leo, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
So, there's a fight brewing again on Capitol Hill, but this time the VA's kind of at the center of it. Could you kind of dive in and tell us what kind of fights brewing on the Hill over the VA?
Yeah, look, this is the second time in less than a month, really, that VA funding has been at the center of some pretty nasty partisan fights on Capitol Hill. Last month, it had to do with the debt limit and, accusations from Democrats that Republicans may be leaning towards cutting some VA funding. Now we've actually gotten the Republicans' first real appropriations plan for Veterans Affairs spending next year. Came in at the president's level. So Republicans are saying, hey, look, we said we were going to fully fund VA. We are fully funding veterans programs, so things are okay. However, baked into that is a change in something called the Toxic Exposure Fund. This was a fund that was created last summer as part of the sweeping toxic exposure legislation that was passed. This is money that's supposed to be set aside for burn pit victims, for Agent Orange victims, for various toxic exposure injuries that veterans get. They're changing just how this fund is administered and how money goes into it, and they're doing it in such a way that a lot of the money can be altered from year to year. It can be moved around, can be shifted to other things. So Democrats are calling that a betrayal of what Republicans promised. They're saying they're making these funds that should have been mandatory, should have been protected. They're making them vulnerable to future cuts. And Republicans are saying, no, we're putting more fiscal responsibility into this. It's just another time that we've seen these fiscal fights suddenly center on veterans issues, which are usually a pretty calm, backwater, bipartisan area of agreement.
In a split Congress, Democrats controlling the Senate, Republicans controlling the House, a Democratic presidential administration, does this have a chance at all of becoming a law?
I mean, look, it doesn't look like it. You've got a divided Congress here. The Republicans in the House are likely going to pass this, but then it's probably dead on arrival in the Senate. It's interesting because this is the first appropriations bill that the House Appropriations Committee has put out. Usually they have a lot more coming out at this time of year, but with the debt limit fight, with some of the back and forth over spending levels, we're well behind that. So this is sort of seen as an opening salvo. This is also seen as like an area where Republicans think they can get some agreement. We'll see whether or not there is. Right now, it doesn't look like there's a lot of support on the Senate side for these significant changes to that toxic exposure fund.
And so where does this leave veterans?
It leaves them confused again. It leaves them wondering what exactly is going to happen with their funding, what exactly is going to happen with this benefits money. Is it going to be protected? I guess the positive in all this is the fact that House Republicans have come out generally at the same level of spending as what the president has said. So it looks like VA will get a raise of about 6% next year, which is another healthy raise for VA. That's more money for programs, support services, more money for VA hospitals. The question is just going to be what fights are baked into that, and does the entire budget process drag that down to a point where veterans funding doesn't get approved in a timely fashion, and we start to run into the same issues we run into every year with partial government shutdowns, with protracted fights, and with lots of headaches over just where the budget will end up.
So much confusion after so much clarity in August when the PACT Act was passed. Well, Leo, thank you for joining us today.
Anytime. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Leo. For more conversations like that one, please like and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Also on your radar for today, a nationalist florist organization has a volunteer opportunity for people who live in the Washington, D.C. area. The Memorial Day Flowers Foundation has been placing Memorial Day flowers at gravesites at Arlington National Cemetery for more than a decade. This year, the organization didn't get enough donations, so it's asking for help. At this time, the foundation said it will have only 80,000 flowers to place at gravesites. That is well below its goal of 310,000 flowers. The foundation needs to raise $150,000 before May 24th to purchase the 230,000 additional flowers. Flowers can be purchased at their wholesale price and shipped in time for the holiday. To donate, look for a link in this story on militarytimes.com. If you're interested in volunteering, you can find that information there as well. The Memorial Day tradition of placing flowers at the graves of fallen troops started as Decoration Day. It began in 1868, a few years after the Civil War. The Memorial Day Flowers Foundation joined the effort in 2011 and has been placing flowers at the gravesites of fallen service members ever since. The organization started by placing 10,000 roses at graves in the cemetery and eventually expanded to cemeteries around the country. And now, here are some other stories that we're hearing chirps about. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin will be the commencement speaker at the Naval Academy's graduation and commissioning ceremony on May 26th in Annapolis, Maryland. A battalion commander with the 1st Cavalry Division, based at Fort Cavazos, Texas, was fired after an investigation found issues with his ability to lead. The Oregon Air National Guard said an F-15D Eagle fighter jet suffered an in-flight emergency and veered off the runway upon landing Monday afternoon. And the head of the artificial intelligence company that makes ChatGPT spoke to Congress yesterday and called for a new federal agency to regulate AI.
And you swear, and you're stating upon your oath, that there's no connection between the destruction of these records and the break-in of the Watergate or any fear that the press or the public might find out from these records what the truth was.
And on this day in history, in 1973, the Senate began its televised hearings on the Watergate scandal. The panel explored who was involved in the break-in at the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in Washington, D.C. during Commander-in-Chief Richard Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign. It also investigated any subsequent cover-up activities. That's it for us this morning. To get more of the top stories and breaking news, go to defensenews.com/EBB to subscribe to the Early Bird Brief newsletter. If you liked what you heard, give us a like wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to follow us on social media at @defense_news and @Military Times. Also, please rate us and be sure to leave a comment. The Early Bird Brief is hosted by me, Jonathan Lehrfeld, and produced by Zamon Z. Perez. Today's episode features stories by the Associated Press, Bryant Harris, Leo Shane III, and Zamon Perez. Our editor-in-chief is Mike Gruss. Have a great day.